Thanks very much for joining us today. Just to let you know, there's actually subtitles available for this event. So if you're to look at the bottom of your screens, there should be a tab that says More. And when you click that tab, there's actually an option to show subtitles. So the event will be providing live captioning. So my name is Christabel Feeney, and to give a visual descriptor of myself, I'm a white female with long blonde hair and blue eyes. And today I'm wearing a light blue turtleneck dress. I'm the Director of Employers for Change, which is an employer disability information service. And I'm delighted to welcome you all here this afternoon to the seminar to discuss accessible and inclusive website design. For employers and businesses, your website is often the front door to what you do and to who you are. And it is really the first impression that both your customers and your potential employees get about you as an organization and the values that you hold. So it really is incredibly important that it's inclusive of and accessible to people with disabilities. Today's session will be facilitated by Vivienne Trulock-Hardy. In September 2004, Vivienne undertook and successfully completed a master's with distinction in interactive technologies for e-commerce at Napier University in Edinburgh. And as part of her master's degree, Vivienne completed a dissertation entitled A Comparative Investigation of the Accessibility Levels of Irish Websites. Following that, in 2005, Vivienne founded Ilikecake Ltd. And her role in Ilikecake is in the area of accessible website design and development, website auditing for conformance of the Wcag guidelines, and general usability testing. So she really is an expert in this area, and we're delighted to have her here today. In terms of housekeeping for the seminar, please turn off your mics for the duration of Vivienne's presentation. We will have questions at the end of the presentation, and you can use the chat box function as well to raise any questions that you have. If you're worried that you might forget them by the end, feel free to share those and we'll keep note of them for them to be answered at the end. Please feel free to share today's seminar and the information that you learn on social media. You can use the hashtag Employers for Change and follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn for updates about other events that we'll be holding over the next coming weeks and months. So without further ado, I'm delighted to hand over to Vivienne. Thanks very much, Vivienne.
Thanks very much, Christabel. So I'm just going to share my screen here and just get started. Screen to share. So can everybody see that on the screen? Is that okay? Yeah, great. So basically, I'm just going to talk about why having an accessible website is important and what to look out for when you're hiring somebody to develop an accessible website for you. And then like really simple ways that you can check that you have, well, at least that you might have an accessible website. So it's a little bit more complicated, but I'll show you some tools. If the tools give you the thumbs up, if they're all okay, it doesn't necessarily mean that your site is accessible, but it's a good sign. All right. But let me talk you through them first, and then I'll show you some examples. Why is my not working? Okay, great. Okay, so I set up Ilikecake in 2005. I've been running it there for 16 years or so. If anybody wants to contact me afterward, that's my email address, and that's our phone number there as well. So currently the guidelines are at level 2.1. So it's the Wcag Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1. And when I started doing accessibility and looking at it, it was 1.0 that was out, and that's been out since about 1999 or so. And then in 2008 they released the version 2, and kind of version 2 was a complete redrafting of the guidelines. And 10 years later, they released 2.1, and 2.1 was basically an extension of the 2.0 guidelines. So they added on an extra load of checks that you can basically put in place. So for example, at AA, there was an extra 12 success criteria added on. So instead of looking at 38 things, you have to look at 50 things. 2.2 is expected this year. It hasn't come out yet, so we're just waiting for that. And then 3 is expected to kind of broaden out to include essentially not really just to focus on websites, but like apps and online tools as well. So that will be kind of in the coming years, I guess. So just a little bit about the legal background. So for quite a long time, there has been a requirement in Ireland to make your goods and services available to reasonably accommodate people under the Equal Status Act, the Employment Equality Act, and then the Disability Act 2005 as well. So they've been in place for quite some time. And more recently, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, they refer to the access to the internet as a human right. So it's something that that everybody should be able to do. And so we have to reduce all barriers essentially to that media. The EU Web Accessibility Directive basically applies to just public sector. This specifically references the Wcag 2.1 level AA guideline. So I'll talk you through what that AA means as well. So there's 3 levels. And then more recently, the European Accessibility Act, the EAA. So this applies to private companies selling products or services that might be important for disabled people and have kind of maybe wide-ranging accessibility requirements in different states. And it applies to all products and services that are sold or used within the EU. So that's regardless of where the actual business is based. And they didn't set any specific standard of compliance, but it's assumed that it will be level AA, probably of whatever level the WCAG version is out at the time. But that's generally a good level to aim for. So why is it important to have an accessible website? So if you just look at the census, and the last census we had out was April 2016, there was a total of, in Ireland, 643,000 people who stated that they had a disability in that. So that's about 13.5% of the population, which is a significant amount. So if your website is not catering for that proportion of the population, you're basically turning away people at the door. Do you know what I mean? You're saying, we don't want your business. The rate of disability for people aged 70 to 74 was 27.5%. That's significantly higher, which you'd expect. So people become more disabled or less able as they age. And then if you look at the population aged 75 and over, it's up to 49.5%, so almost 50%. So it's all ahead of us, guys. So we're by having an accessible digital world, essentially, we're creating a space that we can grow old in comfortably. So having a look just at kind of blind people. So again, in the census 2016, we had over 54,000 people, which is about 1.2% of the population had a sight-related disability. Now, they might not necessarily be fully blind. They might be legally blind. They might have some sight. So a lot of people who are blind, how do they access the internet? So they might use, for example, a screen reader program like NVDA or JAWS. There's a good few of them. And basically what that does is it reads aloud on-screen text. So later on in the presentation, I'll show you a little example of that. Some people will use a Braille display. So basically the tool translates essentially the on-screen information into Braille via an external device, and that they can navigate that via touch. Importantly, and this is something that kind of struck me when I first started thinking about accessibility, was if you're blind, you can't use a mouse to navigate because it's a pointing device. So you have to be able to see where you're pointing. So that means that if you're blind, you're restricted to using keyboard navigation. And that means that the site needs to facilitate keyboard navigation. And again, I'll go through that in a little bit more detail later on. They also can't use positional layout, so they can't follow instructions like that relate to go to the top left, for example. That doesn't mean anything if you can't see what's in the top left. And they can't use colors to infer meaning, so you can't say something like click the red button. Not everybody who has a visual impairment is blind, so some people just have other issues. So they might have, for example, poor visual acuity, so they can't see a lot of detail. They have to be very close up, or maybe they can navigate on a very, very high zoom. Sometimes they might have a poor contrast sensitivity, so they need a good difference between the text and the background color in order to be able to read it properly. And sometimes they might just have problems tracking moving images. For example, they might have a problem with their. You're still upstairs, Daisy. I'm off that. And sometimes they might have a visual field effect. So they might be able to see out part of their eye. So they might be able to see out the center of their eye, but not the peripheral, or they might be able to see out the periphery, but not the center. Or they might just have the lack of ability to change focus quickly. And then there's just some samples there of different issues that people have, and that we need to be able to accommodate those. Colorblind is another huge issue as well. So it's very common. 8% of Caucasians, 5% of Asians, and 4% of Africans have this. It's a sex-linked gene, so that means it's on the X chromosome, the gene for color vision. And that means it's much more likely in men at a ratio of about 10 to 1. Particularly difficult to distinguish are low saturations of color, and it affects about 8% of the Irish population. So that would be about 380,000 people. For deaf and hearing impaired, we've got about 2.2% of the population, so that's over 103,000. And again, looking at the census, by age 77, 1 in 10 people had a hearing impairment, and then by the age of 89, that was 1 in 4, so 25% basically of people would have a hearing impairment at that age. And probably in the early days of the internet, there was little impediment to navigating around, but now there's a lot of focus on video as opposed to just text and image. Much more multimedia environment. So we need to have captioning, subtitles, and text alternatives as well as an option. And then you could also use something like a signing avatar as well, for example. For mobility, there's a huge range. So the census 2016 said that they had 262,000 people, so about 5.5% of the population had a difficulty with basic physical activities. Now, that might not necessarily include anything arm related, for example, but it might just be, so that includes everybody, including wheelchair users, for example. But people that we need to think about that might be trying to use our websites, they could have amputated or broken arms, they could have arthritis, they might have difficulty with fine motor control, they could have cerebral palsy or repetitive motion syndrome, Parkinson's disease, they could be completely paralyzed from the neck down. We don't know. The point is that we should design our websites to facilitate anybody using any of these devices, right? So they might have a large mouse, they might have a stick, sip and puff mechanism, eye scanning software, for example. We don't know what they could be using. So we have to follow the guidelines in order to make it as likely as possible that people will be able to use our site. And then there's a huge range of people with cognitive learning and language impairments. So again, back to the last census, we had 1.4% of the population, so over 66,000 people said that they had an intellectual disability. 3.3% had a learning disability. Some of those would overlap. I think about 70% of the people with intellectual disability also said they had a learning disability. But it's quite a high number again. And obviously, as you age, you're going to experience some kind of cognitive decline. You're more likely to have a brain injury. People with dyslexia would come under this category as well. People with attention deficit disorder. So there's some checkpoints that specifically relate to these particular conditions. Comprehension of the spoken word is likely to be higher than the written word. So people might be able to understand something that's read out, but not necessarily something that's written down, for example. And we need to just be aware of things like context navigation if we have too many problems. So we can add in things to help, like breadcrumbs, site maps, and we could use visited link cutters so that they can tell where they've been. And other things that can help there is limiting the things that might be distracting. So, for example, animations or flash content or rotating logos or slideshows that you can't stop or pause. And then what can help these people as well is using really simple plain English language, and that will help other users as well. For example, people whose first language isn't English. So there's basically 4 core principles to the Wcag. And the acronym is POUR, P-O-U-R. So it's perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. So basically, the user has to be able to identify or find the content on the page using whatever device that they can use. The user must be able to successfully use those, so operate those interactive elements. So the links, the buttons, forms, drop-down menus, slideshows, whatever it is. It has to be understandable. So basically the user has to be able to understand how the interface works, and that's helped by the technology being consistent in how it presents itself from one page to the next, predictable in its design, so it doesn't do something that's unusual or strange. And obviously it needs to be appropriate to the audience as well. And then robust just means that the technology should be standards compliant, and ideally should work on all appropriate technologies. So the users can access that using whatever devices they have access to. So there are 30 level A at the WCAG 2.1. There are 30 level A criteria, and then there are 20 double A criteria. So these are success criteria that your website needs to meet in order to be compliant. So compliance at double A requires that you meet all 30 level A and all 20 level double A. So that means 50 checks altogether. And that's the standard that's referenced. Anywhere there is a standard referenced, it's WCAG 2.1 double A. There is also a AAA. There's 78 altogether in total. It's unusual for websites to aim for AAA, but some might do if they have a particular disability focus, for example. I'm not going to go through all these in detail, but it's just to give you an idea of the type of content that is contained at the different levels. So generally level A, it affords like a basic level of accessibility, and then level AA will follow on from that, and it might have slightly higher requirements. And then there's AAA as well here. So why should your business have an accessible digital presence? So there's a few different reasons. So number one, obviously, I hope I've been able to show you the numbers of people that are affected by different types of disabilities. And obviously, by making your website accessible to those people, you can extend your market reach. You're opening up your products and services to that market. More and more now, diversity and inclusion should be seen as important messages for your brand. So if you can show that you are walking the walk as well as talking the talk, that's generally a good sign. And then quite often you'll find accessibility features solve other unanticipated problems. So I'll be showing you some of those later on in some little videos. Just the kind of some that you might be interested to know would be search engine optimization is often improved once you have an accessible website. So because you're consciously putting in the words in your alt text, in your links, in your titles, in your headings. Again, I'll show you them later on, so how you might do that. But they tend to perform better in terms of search engine optimization. And then generally there's just a normal improvement in normal site usability as well, because you have a strong navigation structure and a consistency to your design. And fourthly, it minimizes legal risks. So if you have an accessible site, the chances of somebody taking a case against you for not being able to access your products and services is much lower. And obviously we're future-proofing against our own aging and our staff, our aging staff as well. So how do you go about getting an accessible website? So first thing I would recommend is to put your accessibility requirements into your request for tender document. So make sure that anybody who's responding to your website request for tender knows that you want an accessible website. So explicitly stated. So even though it's a legal requirement now, I think you should put it in. And then what I would do is I would recommend that you have a look at some sites made by your prospective developer or developers and see if you can do they look accessible. So I'm going to show you some really simple-ish techniques where if they fail, you'll know that they're not accessible. If they pass, you don't know for sure, because I'm not going to show you how to check them all, because some of them are very technical. But certainly if they pass simple checks, it's a good sign. So it's really difficult to tell if a site is fully compliant, because you'd have to check every single one of those success criteria, the 50 success criteria at AA across a few pages. But it's pretty easy to tell if a site is not compliant. Okay, and I'm going to show you some tools to do that. Now, once you've chosen your developer, you're happy that they can deliver an accessible website. Once your site is live, you can use the same tools then to just quickly check that as well. And then if they're failing these simple checks, you can go back to your developer and you can just say, I thought you were going to make me an accessible website, but I can see here that the code is not valid, or there's images here that don't have alt text. Can we sort this out? And it just gives you a little bit of leverage. And then I would recommend that you keep some money from your budget to have an audit done once the site is complete. So once they've addressed any of the issues that you know about, get somebody else who knows what they're doing to check the rest. And keep a small amount from your budget. It doesn't take that much. It's not very expensive to get a 10-page audit done. And then that means that you can be sure that the site is compliant, or if it's not, then you can go back to your developer again. So, and just make sure that your developer has agreed that they will address any issues found in the audit as part of the development fee, so that you're not paying extra ongoing costs. All right, so add that into the contract at the start. So I'm going to show you some useful tools and software on websites and talk about some general concepts. So I've kind of mixed these two up because we've only got an hour. So ordinarily I would kind of address one and then the other, but I'm just going to lump them all in and see how we get on. So we're going to have a look at images first of all. So I'm going to try and keep this as high level as possible, so not get very codey. But there are a couple of times when I'm not going to be able to explain something without showing you examples of code, and this is one of them. But yet there aren't many of these, so just bear with me. So basically, when we have an image on a page, somebody using a screen reader can't access that image in the same way that Google can't access that image. So they can't see what's on the image. They rely on the code. And sometimes the images might just be decorative, right? So sometimes you might have a picture on the page and really its only function is to make the page look a bit pretty, right? In that case, what we do is we have to have what's called an alternative, an alt attribute, right? But we just leave it empty, right? What the alt attribute does, so the empty alt attribute signifies to the screen reader that this image can be safely ignored. So it doesn't have to give a warning to the user to say that there's an image there and there's no alt text, right? So if it's empty, we just if it's decorative, we just have an alt attribute, but it's empty. And that's empty with no space. So it's alt equals quotes, quotes, and that's the end. So when you're getting a content management system, you want to make sure that your content management system allows you to have an empty alt tag. All right. So this is an example. I think it's from the Aer Lingus website, actually, where they've done this, right? And you can see like everything that's available that you might describe in the picture is on the page already in text. Now, sometimes you might have images that do convey information, or they might be functional, so they might be links. So in this case, having an empty alt is no good, because then we're not able to tell the user about the function of the image, right? So for example, if this was a logo and we had an empty alt attribute, that would be bad, right? Because we're not telling the user the content of the logo, like whose logo does it belong to. So what we would do in that case, in the alternative text, we would just add in the name of the company that the logo belonged to, or the name of the organization, or the name of whatever the brand was. And we just put the name in. So we don't say logo of Ilikecake Ltd, or picture of, or image of. We just use the most concise text that we can. Down the bottom here, I have some little arrows. So I came across these on an audit I did kind of a couple of years back. And they had their alt text on, and they accurately described the image, which was left arrow and right arrow. But this is really a fail, because it's not telling us anything about the function of those arrows. So these arrows were images inside links, and they controlled something that was on the page. But left arrow doesn't tell me anything about what happens when I click that arrow. All it tells me is the direction the arrow is pointing, which is really meaningless to somebody using a screen reader. If that alt text had said something like previous video, or next image, or previous page, or next whatever it was, next slideshow, that would make much more sense in that context. So then the user would get there and they'd know, if I click this image inside this link, I will get to the next video. And that would make sense in that context. So to some extent, it's about how that image is used on the page. And we also want to make sure that we're using the alt text correctly. So this is a big issue. So we don't want to use any words that are superfluous. So you never use the words logo or image or any overly wordy text. So don't describe things down to the last gradient, for example. But like taking a look at this image. So this is an image again that I found on a website that I was looking at. The alt attribute on it is event image, which really tells us nothing about the event or the image. Really, we don't know what event and we don't know what the purpose of the image is. So there's two ways to look at this. So is the image a decorative image? If the image is a decorative image, then we just want that alt text to be empty, right? So we don't want to even raise awareness of it. If all the content on the page is captured in the text and the image is just there for visuals, we don't need anything in that alt attribute at all. If the image has a purpose, so let's say that image is related to a news item and there's a particular person, let's say it's an author and they're doing a book signing and you want to talk about that in your news item, that might be relevant. So if that's relevant content, then the alt attribute should reflect that. So we should name the author and name the event. So sometimes the alt content will differ depending on the context that the image is being used in. But either way, you should always think about it from the user's perspective. Okay, so one of the things you're not allowed to do is to have images of text. So unless so there's a few exceptions. You're allowed to have images of logos, that's fine. And you're allowed to have kind of screenshots that contain text, right? Because there's no other way to kind of reference that content. But what you're not allowed to do is what's happened down here. So these little blue buttons down here that say OK and let's go. So these were on a website that I was auditing a couple of years back. And this was actually an image that was made in probably Photoshop with a blue background, some OK text and some arrows. And it did the same thing for the let's go button as well. And the reason that that's bad is that they want, ideally what you should be doing is following the principle of separation of design from content. So we use HTML for content and we use CSS for design, and it keeps the two separate. It also makes it easier to update because you can update the text directly rather than you having to use an extra program like Photoshop, for example. And a really simple way that you can check to see whether your developer has made the images in an image editing program or whether they've added the images, what look like images, for example, the buttons with HTML and CSS, which would be preferred, is that if you go to your web page and you press Control-A on your keyboard, what that does is it selects all. So it highlights everything that's on the screen. If your text changes to this kind of blue outline like this, it means it's selected. So it might look like this, but when it's ordinarily on the page and you press Control-A and it changes to this kind of blue outline. So that means that that is renderable text. So that text is HTML text, and then that's a tick so that you know that that's fine. That's a good check. Now you can I use a little program called Wave. So it's a plugin. It looks like this when you plug it into your toolbar, and it comes up like a little W in a circle. I've put the link to it there. I'm sure we can share these screenshots with you, the presentation with you later on. I've just tiny URL'd it because it's a really long link. And it will kind of highlight some of these errors. It doesn't catch every single thing. It catches, for example, if you've got images in there that don't have alt text, it'll flag that. And it'll flag linked images that don't have alt text. It will pick up those as well. But it can't tell you anything about the quality of the alt text that you've added, unfortunately. As you can see, there's loads of other errors that picks up as well. I'll show you some of those in a bit more detail later on. Keyboards are really important to be accessible. So I'm going to show you this little video here. It's a couple of minutes, like a minute or two long, and then I'll kind of talk through some of the issues with keyboards.
Keyboard compatibility. Not being able to use your computer because your mouse doesn't work is frustrating. Many people use only the keyboard to navigate websites, either through preference or circumstance. Whether it's temporarily limited mobility, a permanent physical disability, or simply a broken mouse, the result is the same. Websites and apps need to be operable by keyboard. Web accessibility. Essential for some, useful for all. Visit w3.org/WAI/perspectives.
Right, so Okay, so that was that one. So I hope you were able to see there that having, oh, sorry, it's playing from the start. Okay, so that having an accessible, keyboard accessible website is useful, not just for people who have to use the keyboard all the time, but obviously for people who sometimes need to use the keyboard as well. So basically what that means is that all interactive elements, including hyperlinks, input fields, submit buttons, menu controls, all have to be fully usable by the keyboard. Now, standard HTML elements are naturally accessible, but when they're highly styled, they can often become inaccessible. So, for example, this is kind of a standard radio button and checkbox, and these work fine all the time. You can always move through them, you can always select them, you can toggle them on and off. But when I see stuff like this, this kind of just basically raises a question mark. Some of them are fine. So sometimes you'll find a kind of a highly styled radio button or checkbox that works fine, but sometimes you'll find that they don't work fine because they're basically what they're doing is they're using pretty advanced CSS to swap out and mimic an actual radio button for something that's not an actual radio button, and that can affect whether the keyboard can actually see it, for example, and whether they can interact with it or not. So these things are just something to kind of keep an eye out for on your site. And then if you do see them, if your developer has implemented something like this, you can just use your keyboard and move through and see, can you select everything and change. So there shouldn't be a keyboard trap on your screen. So the user should be able to cycle through the page without becoming stuck or firing any kind of unexpected behavior, right? So you need to be able to kind of tab through a page and move through everything. And you shouldn't kind of end up having maybe gone down a drop-down menu. This happens sometimes. You go into a drop-down menu to have a look and see what's there. And then as you're using the up and down arrows to move through it, you'll end up on another web page. So it'll have triggered some event that will kick you off the page. So we don't want that to happen. That should never happen. So we don't want anything kind of unexpected to occur when we're navigating through the page. And then another really important one for keyboard is that the focus should be visible, so that when somebody is using the keyboard, they need to know where they are at any one point in time. So when they're using the tab key, for example, to navigate through, it should kind of highlight, it should do something so that it's really clear, oh yeah, I've pressed the tab, I'm on this link, and I press tab again, and I'm on the next link. And so you can always tell where you are when you're navigating around. So just be careful of things like if you have a blue button, for example. So on many browsers, the default focus color is the blue outline. So blue buttons can be difficult to see when the focus is on. Now what your developer can do is they can add an explicit focus style in the CSS. So I'm not going to go into how you do that, but it should look like something like this. So when you go tab, 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 it highlights in some way. So normally it might be just a case of turning on a border or changing the background color. But there's a visible change so that you can tell where you are in the page at any one time. So how do you check? So you basically just open your page in a browser, press the tab key to move forward through your page, and press the shift tab key to move backwards through your page. And then you want to make sure that you can interact with the links, buttons, menus, forms, slideshows, videos, whatever is on the page. You should be able to start and stop and interact with all those things with the keyboard, but so without ever having to use the mouse. You want to make sure that you don't get stuck anywhere on the page, and you want to be sure that you can always easily tell where you are. So you should never have to go, oh, where am I? Right? So if you have to say, where am I? There's probably something wrong. And you basically just want to make sure that nothing unexpected happens. So that you're in control of everything. So if there's a drop-down menu and you can select, for example, somebody out, a person or a thing out of the drop-down menu, that it doesn't fire as you're tabbing through to select. It waits until you press the enter key or tab to a go button to activate whatever that drop-down menu does. Video are obviously very important, and then other media I've just put in here as well, because a lot of the checks for video, for example, having a transcription would have applied to audio as well. So again, I don't know if this will play. Let's just try this. You can tell me if you can hear it.
Web Accessibility Perspectives. Video isn't just about pictures, it's also about sound. Without the audio, you'd have to guess what this film is about. Frustrating, isn't it? Not knowing what's going on. That's the situation for everyone who can't hear. Captions make videos accessible, which is also handy for people who want to watch video in loud environments, or where you need to be very, very quiet. Web accessibility, essential for some, useful for all. Visit w3.org/WAI/perspectives for more information on video captions.
So I don't know about you, but I have a couple of young kids, and when they were small and I didn't want to disturb them from sleeping, I would regularly turn on the
Web accessibility perspectives.
the captions, and to watch my videos. Now I can't get out of this without playing it again. Here we go. Okay, so what do you do when you're adding videos to your website? So videos are very common now, much more now than they were when I started doing accessibility kind of 15, 16 years ago. The very, very, very first thing you should do is you should always check your videos with a tool called PEAT or PIAT, so the Photosensitive Epilepsy Analysis Tool. So the link is there again on the slideshow. You can just follow this down. It's a free tool to download. It's a little bit cumbersome to use, to be honest, but because you have to have your video in certain formats. I think it's AVI from memory. And what it does is it tells you whether there's any parts of your video where the flicker rate might be of a speed that could trigger an epileptic fit in somebody who was susceptible. So somebody with epilepsy can have a seizure if the flicker rate is at a certain speed, right? So, and again, just to give you some numbers there's 37,000 people with epilepsy in Ireland, and that's from the Prevalence of Epilepsy in Ireland report, launched in 2009 and published in 2010. And basically what you get when you run your video through this, there's a couple of different bars down here. There's a pass bar at the bottom, which is fine. There's no problems down there. It's a caution pass, which means that the flicker rate is getting close to the borderline, but it's not a fail until it passes this little kind of skinny black line here. Then there's a caution fail, which is maybe okay, but borderline again. I would definitely recommend that you address anything that comes in here. And then anytime you see lines up here, that's a fail. So anything up here is a fail at that point in the video. And it will tell you the exact kind of seconds into the video where you have a problem. And what you do is, before you ever publish that video live on your site, you go back to your developer, your video editor, and you say, we need to edit out these scenes. And then once that's edited out and you've taken out anything that might have a problem with the flicker rate, you have to recheck it again, just in case that the two new pieces that you've now edited together have something in them as well. So just always run it through until you get a perfect pass. And then once everything is fine, this generates a little report as well. So what you can also do as well, if you're not comfortable using technology and you're getting a video created, again, you might just build that into your agreement with your videographer that they will run it through these tools. They should be, most people who deal with video should be happy enough to do this for you, and give you the report at the end so that you know that your video is okay. It's relatively common, unfortunately. So I would check videos. I'd normally try and check 2 or 3 videos with every site that I look at, just to have a look and see, are they dealing with the issue? And about 1 in 3 fail, unfortunately. So it's a big issue, and you don't want to be responsible for anybody having a seizure on your watch, really. So that's the very first thing. Once your site is going live, then there's a couple of other things that you need to think about adding on. So you want, all videos should really have closed captions added on top. What you can do, this quickest way to do this is you upload your video to YouTube. So a lot of sites would just upload their site to YouTube and then embed the video from YouTube. And what's great about YouTube is that it creates these automatic captions by default. So you don't have to type out every single thing, right? It will generate it for you. But depending on the accent of the person talking, the speed at which they're talking, whether they kind of substitute certain sounds, the automatic caption generator on YouTube will do a good job or a bad job. So sometimes, so I've looked at auto-generated, and sometimes, so rarely, so maybe 20% of the time, it will do a really good job. If the presenter is a really good presenter, has really clear English, it'll get almost everything right. There might be a couple of typos, but generally it'll do a really good job. If the person has any kind of accent, it'll substitute in all sorts of words because it can't tell what the words are. And if it's an unusual word, like a non-standard English language word, that can be tricky as well. So, for example, I've just put in a little transcript here, which was, I didn't want to put in the original because there was a company name in it, but the automatic captions read, Places is a spin-out company. Of it, Real Centre UCity Places has a suite of mobility technologies to assess probability, know the people, which is basically garbage. Okay, so whatever the content should have been, it's not that. So what you need to do is, after YouTube has generated your automatic captions, you need to download those. You need to edit them and fix them. So add in the grammar, add in the capital letters, add in the full stops, the apostrophes, and fix all the word substitutions. And then you re-upload that as an English transcript. And then that sits on top of your video as the captions. And there's a little timestamp to it all, like you can see here, you can see the timestamps. So you just leave those in. So that's the quickest way to get your video to be fully captioned with a complete set of captions. And what that also does is, when you add the captions as a layer on top of the video with YouTube, it also generates this transcript as well at the side. So you're on your YouTube page, you can click on this little these little dots down here, and you can open up the transcript, right? And it will show you the captions on the screen. So in your transcript, we want to have a verbatim record of everything the speakers say. So that's what you should have after you've done that previous step that I just talked about. But sometimes you might need to add in extra things into your captions as well. So, for example, a video that I was watching there a couple of weeks ago, there was two different narrators, a male voice and a female voice, and they were kind of talking about their story. So if it's relevant to who's speaking, then you might want to include that in the square brackets, right? So you might want to indicate the change in narrator, or you might want to indicate that this is the interviewer speaking or the interviewee speaking. And then sometimes you might want to add in things like, if there's applause or laughter off camera that hearing users can hear, but non-hearing users can't hear, we add that in as well. So we describe what's happening off camera, if there's audio that's relevant. There might be questions from the audience, for example, there as well. And then there might be other sounds that might be relevant to what's happening on the screen. So if it's a drama or some kind of acted out scene, there might be a knock on the door, again, off camera, or there might be sirens in the background, or there might be background music. And if any of those are relevant to the understanding of the action that's happening on the screen, they should be added in as well. So we just add them in little square brackets into the captions, and then they appear on the screen as well. The advantages of a transcript as well is that people can download the transcript separately, and they can access the video content without ever having to access the video, so which might be preferable for some people. And similarly, if you have an audio podcast, you must have a transcription of the audio podcast as well. Everything obviously has to have audio control, so the user needs to be able to control the volume, turn it up, turn it down, mute it. Again, if you use any of the standard kind of YouTube stuff, that will be there anyway. And then something else to think about as well is, this is not just related to video, but it does apply to video, but it's also slideshows. So everything should be pausable and stoppable, right? So you should be able to stop the video or pause the video. And also with slideshows, we don't want to ever have a slideshow which just goes round and round and round and can't be stopped by the user, because this is really distracting for some users. So they need to just be able to stop it and turn it off. So you want to have a little stop button, pause button on your slideshow. And that might toggle then to a play button, for example, if they want to restart it. The other issue as well with things like slideshows, where if they have text, if people are slow readers, and it takes them a while to read the content on the slide, and it takes them longer than the slide is there for, which might only be a few seconds, the pause button allows them to stop the slideshow to read the content, and then they can play it again to the next screen, and then they can read the content. So it gives them the control. They're not under pressure to read it in a certain time span. So in terms of navigation, we want one of the biggest hurdles for people who are screen reader users is navigating around the screen quickly enough. So we want to reduce the amount of time they spend trying to access the content where possible. So one of the things that you can do is you can add this skip link tool. So you can have skip to main content or skip to main content. So they don't appear on the site ordinarily, but as soon as you press the tab key, this should be one of the first things that appears. And then the user can just click that link and they can skip over the kind of standard navigation that's on every page and access the actual content on the page really quickly without having to go tab, tab, tab through lots and lots of top header content on the page. And again, Wave will highlight this for you. If you have it there, it'll tick the box. So you have a skip link and a skip link target. One really important thing for screen reader users as well is to use headings correctly. So we want to have headings in the right order. So, and again, by headings, I don't just mean a visual heading. It must have heading markup. So H1 tags, H2 tags, H3 tags, H4 tags, whatever you need. And what that does is a screen reader user then can press the H key on their keyboard, and that will take them to the next level header. And it's really important for those to be in the right order as well. One other thing that you can do as well to help people navigate around is to use semantic tags, for example, like header, footer, and nav in preference to like a standard generic div tag. And that again helps them to be aware of the structure of the page. And again, in Wave, you can click on the structure tab and it will show you have header tags, you have navigation. These are all your titles down here. So this is just a dummy page that I made up. So you'd have your main page title, you'd have some subtitles, you might have some subsections titles, and then you might have some footer and asides as well further down. One thing that can be really useful as well is if you have a linked menu at the top of the page. So if it's a really long page, you have a list of the main sections, and then people can access those links and click them and go straight down to the relevant section. So it saves them having to scan and try and find content if they can get there really quickly. One again thing that's very annoying for screen reader users in particular is repeated links. So if you're a visual user and you have something on your web page which is like a picture at the top and some text underneath, and they both go to the bio page, for example, you can click either of those and off you go, you're happy. If you're a screen reader user, you're accessing the code. So sorry, this is one of the few areas where I have to actually show the code just for it to make sense. So if the image is in a link and the text is also in a link, but a separate link, then the screen reader user gets to the image, it reads out the alt text, and it tells you that's the link. And then you click the tab key to get to the next link, and it reads the exact same text with the exact same link. And so say, for example, if you're on a page which has like 12 bios of the staff members of an organization. And so instead of pressing 12 tabs to access the content to see who's there, you have to press it 24 times. So everything is doubled. So a really quick way to do that is just put everything in the one tag. So you access the tag, you put your image in, you put your text in, you make the whole thing one link, right? So the visual user, it makes no difference at all. There's still a link there, everything's still linked. They can click the image or the text. And for the screen reader user, they just hear one link being read out. In this case, what we do is the image, even though it's in a link, we leave the alt attribute empty because the visible text basically is the alternative text in this case. So we don't duplicate it here and here. We only have it once. One really important thing as well. So this is technically not a fail at level AA, but I think it's really important. So I always highlight it in the audits. Don't use generic terms for links. So don't say something like here, please read our full terms and conditions here, or click here to read more, because it doesn't tell the user anything about that link. So sometimes what a screen reader user will do is they'll navigate from link to link rather than reading the whole content of the page, because they can't scan just to see what's important. If they get to a link and it just says click here or read more, then they have to try and use the arrow keys and navigate around to try and find the previous paragraph or previous heading to try and figure out what that here link meant, which takes just wastes their time. So instead of doing that, try and always include your actual link, I suppose, relevant link content in the link. So instead of having the word here, the link, in this example, the word terms and conditions are in the link, and that is much better because they land on this link and they know that straight away that's the link to the terms and conditions page. Now again, Wave will pick this up, so it's looking for words where they're generic words like here, read more, click here, and it will highlight those to you if it finds a problem. Links can't be empty, so I know we're kind of getting short on time, so I won't spend too long on this, but arrows on slideshows and social media are the kind of key areas where this can go wrong. So you have a button which has no content, or you have a link which has no content. And so the screen reader user gets there and it says blank, 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 and they have no idea what those links are or where they're going to take them if they click them. And again, Wave will highlight these as empty buttons or empty links. We don't want to open up new windows without warning. There's no quick way to check this. You just have to click the links. If the link opens up in a new window, that's particularly problematic for screen reader users if they don't realize that the new window has opened. The back button is now disabled, so they can't get back. And I have seen even expert users go completely wrong because they opened up a link in a new window. They didn't realize it opened in a new window and they couldn't figure out how to get back to the previous page that they were on. So I would recommend never using target_blank anywhere. But if you have to do it, make sure that you warn the user in advance. Normally, best way to do it is through a visual text which says something like link opens in new window. And really good to have multiple ways of getting around. So have a search facility, have a sitemap, have breadcrumb trails, have extra navigation in your footer area. And if you want, you can have an A to Z directory as well. If you have a really big site, this is a really nice way to allow people different ways to navigate around the site so they can use the best system that suits them. And from doing usability tests, I've seen people just use the navigation and I've seen people just use the search. So it's just to give the people that flexibility. Users should always be able to control the display. So, and nothing should ever be hidden or lost if the user decides to zoom. So when the user zooms to 200%, we want them to not lose bits of text like this. And when they zoom, they should be able to use their device in whatever orientation. So if they're looking at your website on a phone, that they can use it in portrait view, in landscape view, and they should be able to zoom to 400%, which is the equivalent to a mobile phone on the screen, so on their computer, without losing any content. So some people with a visual impairment, they might be able to navigate around once they can zoom in really, really high. So we want to make sure that that's working okay. And there's a few color and sensory issues again. I'll just play, I know we're getting really short on time.
Web accessibility perspectives. Colors with good contrast. There's something about great design that allows it to go practically unnoticed. But it doesn't take much to make things confusing and frustrating. Choosing colors with poor contrast makes navigating, reading, and interacting a real pain. Good design means sufficient contrast between foreground and background colors. That's not just text and images, but links, icons, and buttons. If it's important enough to be seen, then it needs to be clear. And this is essential for people with low contrast sensitivity, which becomes more common as we age. With good colors, websites and applications can be easier to use in more situations, like in different lighting conditions. Web accessibility, essential for some, useful for all. Right,
so, okay, so just going to move on. So there's again, Wave will tell you whether there was any fails. Now, it gets this right most of the time, but sometimes it will trigger a false positive, for example. But generally, we're looking for, like you can see down here, this white text on a blue background, this make a donation, fails on everything. So it's not compliant in any size text. It's just an out and out fail, right? This orange button over here will actually pass if the text is large text. So large text means either font size 19 and bold, or font size 23 or 24 in regular size font. But if it's small text, so if it's less than that, and small text, like large text has to be really big to count as large text. But if that text is not that size, that's a fail, right? And there's different ratios of contrast requirements for large and small. So for small text, the contrast ratio is 4.5 to 1, and for large text, it's 3 to 1. And it's a really nice website that I use quite a lot. It's called Snook. Again, the link is there for you if you want to try it out. But I like this because you can plug in your colors. It'll tell you that they're not compliant, but then you can use these little sliders and you can slide them up and down until you get a compliant color combo. That's the same kind of hue, if you like, as the original color, but it's at the right combination. So you put your background colors and your foreground colors in here, and you mess around with it until you get your valid color contrast. Really importantly, to not use color as the only means by which an element's purpose or meaning is conveyed. So for example, in this example here on the left-hand side, the sign up for jobs is in blue, but it's underlined as well. So when we take the color out, it's still easy to see that that's a link, right? On this side, we have our Facebook and our Twitter links. They're in blue, but they're not underlined. So when you take the color out, you can't tell that they're links. So that would be a fail, right? So we can never rely just on color alone. Some people cannot see the difference between these red and green. This is an example of these buttons seen by a person with protanopia, which is a type of color blindness. You can try this out in your own pictures on this link here. So the red and green both appear as kind of shades of, I guess, khaki colors, different kind of, they're different tones, but essentially, if you don't know which one's which, you don't know which one stops it and which one plays it. But by adding stop and go or play and pause, icons or text, that is clarified straight away. So there has to be some other mechanism other than just the text to allow the users to differentiate those buttons. Here's a little example of a pie chart. This is a bad example over here because when a person with tritanopia looks at it, the wake up and the sleep are almost, there hardly any difference between them at all, right? So we add in what's called redundant coding. So we add in some fills in here. So we've got stripes and stars and dots and all sorts of things. And when you look at that as a person with tritanopia now, you can tell this one is stripy, this one is dotty, and you can quickly reference the legend down here. So you know that this one is sleep here and this one is wake up. Correct use of HTML is pretty important. I think it does help with SEO anyway. You can check it. You check our website here at validator.w3.org. You basically plug in your address and you press check, right? What you're looking for ideally is this little green bar here, which says document checking completed, no errors or warnings. Probably what you will get is something like this, where there's a range of different errors. Almost always these errors are easily fixed, but sometimes not. So it will depend on what plugins your developer has used, for example. But a lot of these are fairly simple issues, if not easily fixed, right? So there's nothing very complicated. I'm not expecting people to understand this, but if your site is giving you lots of errors when you run it through the validator, you need to go back to your developer and you need to say, can we get rid of these? Because you know for sure that your site is probably not going to be accessible if it's not valid code. So having a validly coded site will increase the likelihood that any assistive device will be able to work properly with your website. And we also want to use the correct tags for the content. So here's an example of a table. It's absolutely fine to use tables, but really only for data and not for layout. Never nest tables, for example, in your content. And then clearly identify headings using your TH tags. So these ones here would need to be highlighted with the TH tags as opposed to the TD tags, which we would use down here. Just be aware that tables can be a bit problematic from the point of view of getting them to look good and fit on a mobile device. So a 2-column layout is probably going to be fine. A 3-column layout might be okay, but if you're getting bigger than that, if you've got a lot of content in those cells, you're going to have to come up with some really kind of complicated, funky code to display that table in a linearized format on a mobile device. So headings, label, and instructions. So we want every page to have a level 1 header. So that's your H1 tag. So that in this example here, it's the lifestyle and triggers, right? That's the main topic of the page. We want our headings to be logically ordered, and we don't want to skip levels. So this would be a fail down here, right? So we're going straight from a H2 to a H4. So when a screen reader, the person is navigating through the page and they get to the H2 and they click the H key to find the next level header, and then the next one they find is the H4, that can be confusing. They're like, well, why have I got to a H4? Where's the H3? So I've missed the H3. And then they might go back just to check, and it just introduces confusion. So all these H4s here should all be H3s, right, in this one. And then only use header tags if the content is actually a header, and never just make markup content with heading tags if it's not a header. So headers introduce the content that comes next. If it doesn't do that, it's not a header, don't use it. And again, Wave will flag some of these things for you. So it'll flag if you have empty headings, it'll flag if you have skipped heading levels, and it'll flag if you're missing your first level headings. And from checking websites, my experience is that the home page is the one that's most likely to miss the first level heading, because it tends not to have a purpose of its own. Required fields should be clearly marked, highlight them with your little star, put the word required on them, and then do it in the right order. So never tell them that something is required after they've used it, like down here. So for example, in this one here, we have daytime phone numbers and mobile phone numbers. And then somebody using a screen reader accesses this content sequentially, so they go top to bottom. And if the instructions for the content come after the form fields that the user needs those instructions for, then that's a fail. So these instructions should be up here before the user gets to these fields in order for them to be usable for them. So I would recommend checking your site with a screen reader. A lot of people are afraid of using screen readers, and I know when I started to use my very first one I used, it went so fast I couldn't make sense of it at all. But you can control the speed, and I just left mine really slow. You can download a free one called NVDA here. If you can give them a donation, that'd be great. Basically, you just navigate with the keyboard as normal with the screen reader turned on. You're going to use the tab key again to jump to the next interactive element, and shift tag to go backwards. And you can use things like, there's lots of shortcut keys built in. So for example, H will take you to the headings, the next available heading. And then if there's none, it'll say no next available heading, right? Now I had a little video here. I know we're over time. Christabel, will I play this or not, or will I just leave the link in?
And I think, look, if it's only 30 seconds or something.
Yeah, I'll show 30 seconds of it. Yeah, just to give you an idea. So this is basically just a demonstration of somebody using the NVDA screen reader, just to see, so you can see what people experience.
Next generation zone Google Chrome window. Navigation, preparing. Tomorrow's workforce. List with 4 items visited link passport to success. Passport to success next generation zone. Visited link skip to main content. Visited link home pass, out of list heading level 1 passport to success. Your passport to career success will take you, start here. Passport worksheet next generation zone. Visited link skip to main, visited link home passport worksheet, out of.
So you can see kind of how it works. The screen reader user here is obviously relatively advanced. So they're clicking the links before the screen reader has even finished telling them what it is, because they're anticipating what's coming. So that's how people navigate around, and they'll use a lot of the shortcut keys to access the content on the page. Keep in mind that you can use a tool like Wave, but it will only find about 30% of the errors. So it'll only find, for example, the errors that can be automatically checked and verified to be failed. So it can't check any of the stuff that you have to manually check, for example, like the quality of the alt text, for example. And there's lots of stuff that I haven't covered just because we don't have the time. And they do occasionally report false positives as well. So sometimes they might trigger something that's not an actual fail. But there are great places to start. So I would recommend, if you're getting an accessible website, install Wave, have a look at your site through it, run it through the validators, and obviously if you're using the video, make sure you check it with the PIAT epilepsy tool before you go live with it on YouTube.